Thank you for tuning in to Shared Hope International's Invading the Darkness, an anti-sex trafficking podcast. We want to acknowledge that the content we discuss can be emotionally challenging and may evoke strong reactions. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Invading the Darkness, where we shine a light on stories that have been overlooked, misunderstood, and too often ignored. I am Kim.
And I am Yvonne. In today's episode, we hear part of a powerful keynote from Shared Hope's 2023 Just Conference. In it, Tiffany and two members of her legal team share her story, which exposes the justice system's failure to recognize Tiffany as a sex trafficking victim, an all too common reality for other survivors just like her.
Tiffany and her team will share the story about how her trafficker used her phone, leading her to be charged as a trafficker herself. What could she have done in that situation? The answer? Nothing. She was powerless. But thankfully, her story didn't end there.
That's right, Kim. You'll hear Tiffany speak about the pain of being failed by the justice system and her fight to have her case recognized for what it truly was, a case of victimization, not criminal behavior.
Get ready to hear a survivor's perspective that challenges everything that we think we know about trafficking and justice. Let's dive into the first part of Tiffany's keynote at the Just Conference.
This is Tiffany's first public appearance. 1 year ago, Tiffany was also known as inmate number 10007737771, I believe. Did I get that right? Close enough. It had a lot of sevens in it. Tiffany was released from prison on Thanksgiving Eve of last year after serving 11 years of a 30-year sentence for trafficking a minor. She was a minor when she received that sentence, and she was a human trafficking victim. She had the representation of an incredible legal team that helped her, that was led by the woman next to her, Susan Coppage. Susan's from Dalton, Georgia, but she spent a good bit of time up here in D.C. when she was the Obama-appointed ambassador at large for trafficking, the Office of Trafficking Against Persons. Y'all can applaud. I told you we weren't dumb. So we're going to go ahead and get into it and talk today with Tiffany and hear from her about her story. We do not have to tell anyone in this room what the vulnerabilities are that lead to trafficking. Y'all are all experts in the field. Tiffany's case was no different. Tiffany's vulnerabilities included that her parents were not around. She had troubles at school. She was a runaway at the age of 15. She had a lack of support. These are all the things that led to Tiffany's trafficking. But we would like to hear from you. From your perspective, what do you think some of those vulnerabilities were?
I believe that one of my biggest vulnerabilities, again, like you said, were basically that my parents weren't around. My mother was a struggling alcoholic since she was 16. And my father went to prison when I was 6. So a lot of it came from the fact that I didn't have that fatherly love or that image, whereas I ended up looking for it in grown men.
And then when you experienced trafficking, we know that your trafficker gave you drugs to keep you compliant.
He did.
Also typical of what we see in trafficking, that you had an intimate partner and you were essentially engaging in survival sex as well because you were struggling being a runaway. And that love and support turned into emotional and physical abuse.
It did on a daily basis. He was abusing me. We would have arguments, and they would end up turning into where I would end up having bruises all over my face. There was one point when I was 6 months pregnant that he actually stabbed me in my left knee.
Would you like to talk a little bit now, Susan, about the case itself from your perspective as legal counsel?
Thanks, Amy. So you heard that Tiffany was arrested when she was herself a minor. That was back in 2011. She was arrested in South Georgia by local police who didn't really have the education we know matters to law enforcement. The purchasers of the other juvenile, the 13-year-old, had told police that they had also paid to have sex with Tiffany, which under Georgia or federal law made her a sex trafficking victim. But they did not treat her that way. They did not investigate the case that way. Instead, they charged Tiffany with trafficking her friend. This room is a very educated audience, and it knows that traffickers will use current victims to recruit future. And law enforcement, I believe now, does know that, but we need to keep up the education so that new law enforcement investigators continue to understand what trafficking is. And they never charged Tiffany's trafficker with trafficking her. So it was really a failure initially of the investigators and not having anyone there to be an advocate for Tiffany. So, Tiffany, you didn't share with law enforcement what had happened to you, which is also, as we all know in this room, very common. When did you become aware that you might be a victim, and how did you become aware of that?
Well, as I said earlier, my dad, he was in prison when I was 6. So when he found out that I was locked up, and he kind of knew a little bit of my story, but I never went into detail with anybody about what was going on. And he ended up sending me this article about an organization called Fair Girls. And I read the article and I was like, hey, what could happen? Either I would hear back or I wouldn't. So I wrote a letter, I reached out, and it was like a week later I got a response. And then a week after that, I had an attorney visit.
And who was it that responded to you when you were in custody? What was her name?
It was Andrea Powell.
And Andrea Powell with Fair Girls and now with Corona Rising swung into action, and she told Tiffany that trafficking was what happened to her. It was not who she was, which I just love that sentiment, that you will move on beyond this because this is a crime that was perpetrated against you. It's not who you are. And so she stepped in and got an initial lawyer in Georgia who came out to represent Tiffany. And this is Tiffany with her, working with Corona Rising and Andrea to try to raise awareness of what had happened to her. So this is Tiffany in her own words explaining how she had ended up being a victim of this horrible crime. And the NGOs, initially, many of them were reluctant to work with someone who had been charged with trafficking another minor. In the continuum of crimes, that's pretty far down on the serious list, right? This is not a prostitution offense, which a lot of states have a safe harbor law against. It's not a drug offense or selling fake IDs. It's actually a trafficking of another minor. But we need to step back as a society and say, if you can't consent to the commercial sex acts, if there's force, fraud, or coercion over you, that extends to the crimes that you're forced to commit as a direct result of being trafficked. So her initial attorney did come from the Barton Law Center at Emory, and he filed what we call in the law a habeas petition. I promise I'm not going to make you all lawyers today. But a habeas petition has a really high burden because the criminal justice system favors finality, and to go back and look at the initial conviction, which in this case was a plea, and we'll get a little more into that. But to go back and undo that plea, the hurdles in Georgia were very high. At some point, Andrea got frustrated with that attorney, and she reached out to the sitting ambassador at large at the time, John Cotton Richmond. And John and I had been friends before as DOJ civil rights prosecutors. And he said, "Oh, it's in Georgia. You should call Susan." And my phone rang at a time when I was working at a law firm, and I was really excited to take on Tiffany's case. So we had a new law in Georgia that was going to help with that. It's our vacature law. It passed for the first time in 2016? No,
20
sorry, my time's off. 2021?
2021.
2021, sorry.
Yes, yes.
I was back in my ambassador days. 2021, and before that, we hadn't had this opportunity. Many states may have vacature laws, other states may still need them, but are they being put to use? Tiffany's case was one of the first in Georgia that was filed under our vacature law, and it is the first that I know of where the district attorney objected, but we'll get to that. I think next slide.
Yes. So in Georgia, our First Lady, Marty Kemp, has taken up human trafficking as one of her signature issues. Susan mentioned our vacatur law. It's called the Survivors First Act. We're going to hear right now from the First Lady and our Attorney General a little bit more about why that was important in Georgia to pass back in 2021.
Once rescued, victims of human trafficking have an incredibly difficult road to both rehabilitation and reintegration into society.
And some victims still carry around the weight of a criminal record while trying to heal from the trauma they've experienced.
That's why Governor Kemp and I worked with Attorney General Chris Carr and members of the Georgia General Assembly to institute the Survivors First Act, creating pathways for survivors of sex or labor trafficking to clean up their Georgia criminal history.
The Survivors First Act gives a trafficking survivor the opportunity to do one of two things: have their conviction essentially erased if the conviction was a direct result of trafficking, or to restrict access to their record if the arrest happened while they were being trafficked.
It is our hope that these new remedies will help victims heal by removing barriers to employment, housing, and other important steps towards rehabilitation.
If you've been convicted of a criminal offense while being trafficked, or as a result of being trafficked, you may be eligible to petition for relief. The forms you will need, as well as a list of resources, are provided at law.ga.gov.
With these remedies, we can and we will continue taking important steps to end human trafficking and ensure the state of Georgia is a safe haven for those who have been victimized.
So when the Kemps first took office in Georgia, I got to be honest, we were like, come on, y'all, we've been doing this work a long time. Y'all know this feeling, right? Here we have somebody coming into office. They want to take up the cause. We're like, okay, we've been doing it for a while. But one of the first things that Marty Kemp did was say, I don't know a lot about this issue. And she started to engage survivors. And she actually met with many survivors to really hear firsthand what that experience was. And I think it really ended up guiding her in a lot of the work that she's done and led us in Georgia. And she's now become, I think, on the forefront and even in the rest of the country in terms of executive branch agencies at the state level that are really, really trying to be victim-centered and trauma-informed in the way as a state we're responding to human trafficking. So, and Susan, being the attorney in the room, is going to break down that law a little bit more for us now.
We have attorneys in the room. Are there attorneys in here? Okay, great. So all attorneys know that a lot of the work on a case is done by the paralegal. So I want to take a minute and give a shout out to Jennifer Brown, who was the paralegal on the case.
Yay, stand up, Jennifer. Jennifer, stand up.
She was amazing. But here's the framework of the law, and it's so helpful in Georgia to have people in elected political office embracing this vacature law. So it is the Attorney General's form on his website, as he said, that we are using to seek vacature. It can now be done at any time. When it first passed, we're going to go with 2021. When it first passed in 2021, it had a provision that you had to wait till you'd been out of prison for 6 months. And I'm like, why do you have to wait? If it's good, 6 months later, it should be good while you're still serving your sentence. So we got it changed to at any time. And this is just another example of how you'll get a law, you get the law you get, but you can continue to work on it and tweak it with the real world examples of how it's not working as intended. And then you have an affidavit in Georgia that creates a rebuttable presumption. Maybe you will be lawyers by the end of the day. This rebuttable presumption.
Some of us don't want to be lawyers.
This rebuttable presumption says we presume that you were a trafficking victim and that the crime was committed as a direct result of being trafficked unless the other side, in this instance the DA, overcomes that rebuttal. So it takes the burden off of you filing the form and puts it on the state. So that was wonderful. And the affidavit can come from an attorney, a government official, a service provider, a pastor. It can come from anyone who has knowledge of the crime and the survivor's journey. And if the district attorney doesn't respond to the petition within 30 days, within 30 days, then it's granted. So the vacature happens. And vacature means the record is hidden from the public, but still available to law enforcement. So it's still viewed, but only by law enforcement. But if the district attorney objects, then you have a hearing within 90 days. The hearing is a preponderance of the evidence standard, which is lower than beyond a reasonable doubt, and the judge may grant the petition at that time after the hearing. So as I said, we filed one of the first under the revised law, the at any time, and in Georgia it's also at any crime, and in Georgia it's also at any age. So this is my mantra. It should be, when you go back to your states, any crime, any time, any age, okay? That's what you're looking for. Yes. That's the gold standard. So in our case, the DA objected within 2 days of my filing the petition. That's pretty quick. That's a pretty quick objection. So we initially had the exciting call with Tiffany that it's been filed, and 2 days later we were telling her the DA had objected. How did that make you feel?
Oh, I was devastated. I felt like at that point it was just another failed attempt. And with each attempt that continued to fail, it really made me just continue to give up hope. So with that, it was just like another little piece of hope that was just given way.
And you had been in custody at this time about almost 11 years. How did you maintain some of that hope while you were in custody?
I think a lot of it came from the fact that, well, for one, I believe in God and I believe in faith. But I think, I think the most of it really came from the fact that I knew that I had a little boy waiting on me. When I got locked up, he was only 3 months old. So.
I think next slide.
Sorry, I was having a moment.
So
Might be a couple of those before we're over.
So the district attorney in his negotiations with me indicated that he thought you could be both a victim and an offender. And I said, yes, but under Georgia law, anyone who commits a crime as a direct result of being trafficked should have that vacated. She had already served 11 years, as we've discussed. And he just wasn't being very cooperative. I'm a former federal prosecutor, so I thought, oh, I'm a prosecutor, he's a prosecutor, we'll be able to speak the same language. Not so much. Didn't have a lot of awareness about trafficking. And so I was running out of leverage as an attorney. And if you are a lawyer, you know about 50% of law is actually the law, and the other 50% is pounding the pavement and calling people and getting things done through the people you've worked with in the state. And so Andrea from Corona Rising had a connection to a reporter at the Washington Post. And everybody advised me that the media involvement could go either way, that it could backfire and this DA would dig in his heels, or it could put the pressure on him that he needed to see the light, right? And so as an attorney, it was a very challenging moment for me, and I must have polled 50 of my friends who are lawyers going, I don't know what to do in this situation. But he wasn't coming to the table. So we agreed to have the Washington Post reporter, Jessica Contrera, cover Tiffany's case. In Georgia, cameras are allowed in the courtroom, And so she filed a request to bring the cameras into the courtroom for the vacatur hearing. And within 2 days of the judge saying she could bring her cameras into the courtroom, the DA called me again, let's work this thing out. So in this instance, the media response, I think, did bring him to the table. He still wanted her to have a record. He wanted to justify, I believe, the 10 years she had already served. And the vacatur law, as I've said, was new and had never had a contested hearing. So we get to the point where Tiffany has a choice that she can proceed with the vacatur law. And this is the speech I gave her in Camilla, Georgia. We went on the law. We went on the facts. I don't know this judge. She sees this DA every day. I don't know what she'll do. So 20% for me was a big black hole. I didn't know. So I said, Tiffany, what do you want to do? Do you want to take this deal? And in Georgia, we have first offender treatment, so she would receive first offender, and after she had completed her probation, her record would still be hidden because first offender records are removed. Or do you want to fight for the vacatur and have a clean sweep of this? And what was your choice, Tiffany?
Well, I can definitely say that it was really, really hard. But I think given the fact of that I trust Susan and the work that she had been doing, I made the decision to just go ahead and take the plea or the deal that the DA was offering, even though I felt like it was really unfair. But I also just looked at the opportunity of I've done it 11 years, so I'm ready to go. I'm ready to get this over with. I'm ready to move on with my life and be able to see what God has planned for me in the future.
So we decided to agree to plead to a felony, but I was still digging in and being difficult with respect to pleading to a felony involving the 13-year-old victim. Because a felony with that individual would have put Tiffany on the sex offender registry, and we did not want her there. We did not believe she should be there, and that would have ruined her chances of doing things with her son going forward. So we are sitting there in court, still knocked down, dragging. He's telling me it won't put her on the registry, and I'm telling him it will. So we're having a little disagreement about that. But finally, he came up with an offense of keeping a house of prostitution, but that would have been on herself. So she was both the house and the prostitute. And that's the deal we worked out that would get her out of custody. It did come with 500 hours of community service, which
500 hours of community service, and I have to graduate a long-term program.
And Tiffany's in the program and doing the community service as we speak, so that's on track. But it was a real struggle and a real challenge to get this through, even though, again, you saw the First Lady and the AG are behind it. It makes the path a little easier, but not smooth sailing all the way.
So I wasn't involved in any of this. I was hearing about it, though, because up at the state level, there was a lot of buzz around what was going on with Tiffany's
remember,
case.
I said I was calling everybody I knew.
The buzz is sitting to my left.
Lawyering via telephone.
And I have a vested interest in the reputation. You heard me open with a lot of pride in what we do in Georgia. I'm very proud of the work that we do. We're not perfect, but we do really great work. And I, of course, had a ton of compassion for Tiffany's case, but I also didn't want the Washington Post coming into Georgia and reporting on something that we thought was very contrary to our priorities in the state. So I drove down to Bainbridge, Georgia. I got myself involved in this case, and I drove down to Bainbridge, Georgia, and I met with the DA, called Susan in as well, and tried to say to him, this is what the priorities of the state are. You heard it shortly, just a moment ago from the First Lady herself. And so we really wanted him to understand why Susan was doing what she was doing and why we have those priorities in the state. But it took him a minute, and it took him, being in a courtroom with the Washington Post to be motivated. The photograph that you see right now is from the Washington Post photographer, And I love that photo because it's the moment after Tiffany learns that she's going to be released. And if you look over in the back right, there's a blonde lady. That's me. That's the first time Tiffany Simpson ever laid eyes on me. I just want you to know she had never met me before. She was in the middle of, probably one of the biggest moments of her life. And I'm like, hi, I'm Amy Hutzel. Nice to meet you. Well, she saw me again. She saw me again. How many days later? Like 4 days later, 3 days later,
Jennifer,
I think.
So
Jennifer, how many days was it?
This is rural Georgia, and we took the plea in one county for crimes that occurred in 2 other counties, and they weren't able to email the order around. So again, paralegal to the rescue. Jennifer comes in and is driving a hard copy of the order to the different county clerk's offices.
By horseback.
Yeah.
Horse and buggy.
To let them know that the judge has ordered the release of Tiffany.
Tiffany's story is just beginning, and as you can hear, the emotional toll of what she went through is hard to fully grasp. But it's in this moment that the fight for justice truly began. And to hear how Tiffany found hope in her path towards justice, you'll need to stay tuned for part 2.
That's right. You won't want to miss the rest of Tiffany's keynote and the powerful conclusion to her story and the lessons learned from her case that are being used in the field today. Stay with us for part 2, where Tiffany will share what it took to get the justice she so rightfully deserved. You won't want to miss it.
You may have to wait until next week to hear the powerful end of Tiffany's story, but you do not need to wait to take action for boys and girls, just like her, who have been denied the justice they deserve. Text Shared Hope to 52886 or visit the link in the description below and tell your legislators to fight the unjust incarceration of juvenile sex trafficking victims.
Thanks for listening to the powerful part of Tiffany's journey. We'll be back soon with part 2. Until then, let's keep shining the light into dark places. And again, text Shared Hope to 52886 or visit the link in the episode description to take action. We will see you next week.